How's everyone doing today? Welcome into the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiege, coming to you again with another round of stories and topics to talk about on today's episode. On today's episode, I'm going to be covering what Sean McDermott said in terms of measuring success for the Buffalo Bills over these last few years. Later on in the show, I'm going to give you guys my very own tier list of the best free agent moves and teams that have been going on throughout this offseason. I have 4 tiers for you guys, and I'm going to rank some of the teams that fall into those tiers, as well as telling you guys every story, tidbit, and kind of quotes that have been coming out of the NFL coaches meeting thus far over these last 2 days now officially. All of that and more coming on today's episode. Remember always to like and follow the show, as well as subscribing to both YouTube channels. And before I get into the first topic, I want to remind you guys again, if you have any questions or comments for me during this live show, to use the tip and donations link running across the ticker below me to be able to see the question over here to my right. I'm able to see it if you use the link at gsmcpodcast.net. Makes it easier for me to interact with you guys. It makes it more fun for me. And it's a big help for the show and all of the shows across the network as well if you guys are able to do that. Now, talking, like I mentioned before on one of the topics, Sean McDermott and the Buffalo Bills, a common topic, I think, for the Buffalo Bills and Sean McDermott. Ever since he got there, he became the head coach in 2017. And this era didn't officially really start until Josh Allen got there in 2018. And then this sort of whole project and the way the Bills have been able to become this powerhouse team in the AFC, I don't think it's too crazy to say that now because of how they've performed consistently in the division and in the conference. And to some people, it might seem like, that's impressive. That's really well what they've done from the time that McDermott got there and what that level of quality of team that was to where they are now and how everyone views him now with Josh Allen, how he's arguably a top 3 to 5 quarterback in the NFL. That whole process has been very demanding, has been put in a lot of hard work by Sean McDermott and this team. And props go out to them for being able to construct this team to where it is now. That's one side of it. On the other side of it, you have people that would still criticize this team for falling below expectations. And, that comes with it, right? Everyone loves seeing the underdogs perform well. But then once you start performing really well, get better each and every year, like Josh Allen has, like the Bills have been able to build up this roster, it turns on you, right? It becomes almost unfair, if you want to call it. You start becoming really, really good, and all of these fans and people that wanted to see you win now become your biggest critics, start to turn on you a little bit, and the hate starts to become a little louder from people that say, yeah, this team is good, it's performing well in the regular season, but what have they done in the playoffs? Where is that level? Why does that level drop off? And why doesn't it seem like they can get past Pat Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs every time they play them? Those, in all fairness, are fair questions when you get down to, the bottom line of it all. The playoffs are what matter. A lot of times it's what great quarterbacks, the best of the best, are judged on. And like I mentioned, where this Buffalo Bills team has come from, they've won the AFC East the last 4 years. They've only made the divisional round the last 3 years. And to that and all the naysayers and critics that have been out there recently about the Bills and Josh Allen, really, in this whole Josh Allen era, Sean McDermott went out into the media and answered some of these questions, to which he said, to say we haven't had success or Josh hasn't had success, I think would be kind of narrow-minded. It's hard to win in the NFL, so you kind of regroup every year and you make it one game at a time. That is, what you'd expect from Sean McDermott to say. Narrow-minded, I think. I wouldn't have said that, but it is fair to kind of categorize it in that way because of that is sort of the aspect and the landscape we find ourselves in now. Great players are validated or judged on winning championships. That's what validates a career. That's what validates a good player. And where people, quarterbacks, NBA players, and all of that stuff, where you see it a lot more, that's where they fall in line in these rankings. Who has more championships? That's the first thing people look to. And it is a valid point to make. But when you're looking at the Buffalo Bills and you're seeing how good they are, I think it's important to determine what we're talking about and what we deem is success. What aspect of the game, of the season, are we talking about? Is success measured on where this Buffalo team has come from and where they are now? In that case, if you're just talking about the journey and how they've made and revolutionized this team into what it is now, a good team, an established team, I think it has been way more than successful. I think it has exceeded expectations. When Josh Allen was drafted, a lot of people didn't really see him as anywhere near where he can be now. He's an awesome quarterback now, like I mentioned, top 3 or top 5. And if we're talking about just that, their journey, the process of establishing this team, like I mentioned, I think it is very successful. But obviously the Bills want to win Super Bowls. Sean McDermott reiterates every time that that's the ultimate goal that they want to get there. It's not like they're not trying to get there. Obviously, that's the final goal, like it is with everybody. But it is a long process, and I think a lot of people, which is what he's trying to say, lose the idea that it's never really the same team, like he mentioned in his quote. You lose players. They lost a ton of players this year, and it was a struggle last year. They actually fired Ken Dorsey, their offensive coordinator, midway through the season, and it sparked them and made them win out most of their last few games in the regular season. They beat the Dolphins twice, I think, towards the end of the season, that won the division, and they were able to sneak in that way, which is great. But it seemed to me like last year the team was sort of teetering. They were at this breaking point where where the pressure was gonna make diamonds for them, or it was just gonna blow up and everything was gonna fall apart for them. It turned out very positively for them, but now you kind of see the fallout out of it, and it seems like that was their last, real go at it, because they lost Jordan Poyer, Gabe Davis moved on, and on top of that, they released Tre'Davious White as well. So offensively, they were decent. Josh Allen makes them that much better, makes them really good. But defensively, it was sort of their identity that a lot of people weren't really talking about, and it carried them into these tight games, kept them in games a lot of times against the Kansas City Chiefs team, a lot of the times with Poyer, Tre'Davious White, and all these playmakers that they had. Now that they're losing them, I think a lot of people aren't really talking about how significant that's going to be for this team. And talking about success and how you measure it, if you want to measure it, like I mentioned before, in terms of just where this team has been and where it is now, again, it is successful. But if you're talking about Super Bowls and winning them and competing with the Patrick Mahomeses, the Baltimore Ravens, the San Francisco 49ers, they're all judged, maybe not so much the Ravens, because Lamar hasn't really done that well, that much better than Josh Allen really in the playoffs, so I won't give you that one, the Baltimore Ravens, but the 49ers, the Chiefs especially, these teams are now judged on, Super Bowls. The 49ers are one of the most established teams in the NFL, one of the leaders in terms of Super Bowls, so they've earned that pedigree, that legacy, that standard that people hold them to now. That's all based on Super Bowls and that legacy. Now with Patrick Mahomes as well, he's on a whole different trajectory on GOAT status, competing with Tom Brady, because he's winning Super Bowls, he's winning these championships, these accolades, and that is a different category, I think, on judging success. If you want to judge it, like I mentioned, on the process, that's where the Bills are successful. But in terms of Super Bowls and fitting this criteria that a lot of people measure careers and trajectories and how good a player is, I don't think they have been that successful. Unfortunately, that's how it is now. Is it unfair? It could be. But at the same time, how else? You can't devalue the fact that teams that win more Super Bowls should get more praise because that's the ultimate goal. That's the hardest thing to do. And if one team, one player has more than another, you have to look at that one player with more Super Bowls as higher or better because they were able to reach the mountaintop over and over again. So you have to really determine and clarify what we're talking about here, where success is measured. And that just brings me also, before I wrap up this segment, to the topic of most accomplished quarterback or most accomplished player and most talented. I think you could swing this conversation in that direction because a lot of people will say Tom Brady's the GOAT. And some people will say he's the most accomplished. He's won the most Super Bowls, has the most accomplished career. While others say the most talented is now Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers has been thrown in there. You could split it up like that into those categories, and comparing Josh to these other quarterbacks, I think Josh, when comparing him to Patrick Mahomes or these other quarterbacks that might have more Super Bowls than him, you can say he's a better talent, he's a better player of football at the quarterback spot, but holding the trophies, the accolades over his head, a lot of times will swing people in that favor of the one with more success and Super Bowls. It is unfortunate how it is now, and with everything really being statistical and there's a stat for everything and there's information on anything, that's really the thing that people go back to more and more often than not, and it's where the Bills stand right now. They're still good. It's not saying that they can't ever win a Super Bowl, but with the team that they had overall, I think the final thing to take away from this is that Sean McDermott and the Bills are trying to make that next step. And regardless if people think they're successful or not, I don't think that's really what matters here because they're judging the past and what you have done. If they win the next two out of the next three Super Bowls, this whole conversation is really irrelevant, and people won't remember any of these things that they've said badly about the Bills. But now it becomes more of a challenge, like I mentioned, because they've lost so many people. They have to try and change their identity, I think, really. But as long as they have Josh Allen, they have a really legitimate chance of getting there and at least getting these chances over and over again because a lot of teams, a lot of organizations don't have that luxury of having a top quarterback, very talented, game-changing quarterback to have all these opportunities. I think the Bills are definitely not taking it for granted, and you're seeing it now when people ask Sean McDermott these questions, how it could get annoying because they keep trying and falling short, and you can understand why he feels that people aren't valuing getting there, how hard it is, but at the end of the day, that's how it is measured right now, and probably how it's always going to get measured because of how important the Super Bowl and winning championships is in sports, not just football, but in other sports as well. So that's interesting. I thought the comments were very interesting from Sean McDermott, but you can make good points on either side of the argument, and nothing really matters until the Bills go out there and prove people wrong, and these comments are still just going to be there for Sean McDermott to entertain us with some of his answers. But that's where I'll leave that topic and the Buffalo Bills. I have a lot more to get into in today's show, but before I do that, I'm going to send it into the first break, and on the other side, I'm going to bring you guys my tier list of the best teams, in my opinion, that have just hit a home run this offseason, and some teams that have fallen short and gotten worse this offseason, plus what's coming out of the NFL coaches meeting and the new kickoff rule as well that was just released here today at the NFL coaches meeting as well. So a lot more stories, a lot more topics to get into on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their face shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm
impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news if it's some losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to get into the second segment of the show, my tier list of the best teams that have just rocked this offseason. I like their additions. They're really improving. And some teams that have fallen short, haven't really lived up to my expectations more than anything. And the list I have here, I broke it up into 4 tiers that I measured the best teams, some teams better than others, and some down the list. The first tier, the best tier, is just the best offseason in my opinion. Really hit everything out of the park and are just crushing everything they do. The second tier is really good, but they're missing just one thing that's holding them back from being really, by having a really good offseason. The third tier is solid. They've improved, but there still remains questions on other parts of their organization, on their team, outside of just the players and their additions. And the last tier is the most disappointing teams in the NFL and teams that really just got worse and haven't done anything to counteract them getting worse by signing other players to counteract that. So those are the 4 tiers. I have a couple of teams in some of them and only 1 or 2 teams in other tiers. So in saying that, I'll start from the top. The best offseason, without a doubt, in my opinion, has been the Houston Texans, and they've had some losses this offseason. They've lost a few players. I know Steven Nelson is a free agent. Dalton Schultz was almost lost, but they were able to re-sign him. They lost Jonathan Grenard. They're one of their best pass rushers last year, and they lost Blake Cashman. But they've basically replaced mostly all of those with just as good of players or potentially even better players. And that's really what did it for me on how they just had so much success last year. DeMeco Ryans was a rock star as a new head coach. He came in and just blew the doors off of everything, and he was a great rookie head coach. He won the Rookie Head Coach of the Year award, not to mention C.J. Stroud as well. Probably up there with one of the best rookie seasons by a rookie quarterback. And just on that, the amount of now pressure, I guess you could say, that's on this team to live up to that in their second year because of how good the first year is. It's a lot louder when you don't perform in that second season or you drop off a little bit. Everything is amplified a lot more. And I think they've just set themselves up really well with the moves that they made. Like I mentioned, they lost Jonathan Grenard, but they added Danielle Hunter. They lost Devin Singletary, and they added Joe Mixon. So you could say they got better potentially at both of those spots. They lost Blake Cashman, but they brought in Azeez Al-Shaair from the Tennessee Titans. And they also brought in Danico Autry. And now they just need that last cornerback, defensive back. They don't really need it because Steven Nelson, I know, was good. He was one of their starting quarterbacks. But I think they could get away with, plugging in a cheaper option there. But if they wanted to get another player, bring in a really good player, there's still options out there. Xavier Howard has been linked to them a lot because he is from Texas. He said it on a podcast, I think. I saw him say it on the Udonis Haslam and Mike Miller podcast that he would love to play with the Houston Texans because of that connection that's there. And if he were to be added there, it just makes them that much of a better team and really leaving no cracks in this team where they could fall short in one of these positions. They're really improving this team, and I love how they've just not really settled, and they've gone out, gotten better players, tried to improve this team, now that it almost catapults them into serious contention for the AFC. I'm really close to putting them up there with, honestly, like the Chiefs or the Ravens and the Bills, if you want to throw them in there. I'm really close to doing that, but they are so young, so that still lives in the back of your head. But overall, I love what the Houston Texans have done. Big fan of CJ Stroud and seeing how young their team is and exciting is. So they got the best offseason grade for me. They stand in that tier all by themselves. And just below them, the really good tier, really impressive offseason, but they just missed on one thing, or they're lacking in one department, really. That would be the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Minnesota Vikings, and the New York Jets all fall into this category. Starting with the Steelers, they revamped that whole quarterback room, got rid of, Mitchell Trubisky, Mason Rudolph, Kenny Pickett, and they brought in two options that you could really argue are better than all three of those guys, Justin Fields, Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson, recency bias shows that, he might not be as good at least 2 seasons ago, but last season he was sneakily very good. Definitely better than the numbers that any of the quarterbacks on the Steelers put up. So that's an improvement regardless. Justin Fields really is more comparable to those three guys that left, but he does show that potential, that just talent that sits there, and that Mike Tomlin has said he can't wait to try and really fulfill that potential. That's really what separates those two from the quarterbacks that they have had in there. I think you got the best and knew exactly who those three quarterbacks were. So that's an upgrade at the quarterback position. On very little money as well, I might add. Just, I think, $3 or $4 million is what's their salary cap hit for these two quarterbacks. So, low risk, high reward potentially with one of these two guys. That's an awesome move. The Patrick Queen signing is an awesome move for them because they haven't had a player like him since Ryan Shazier, and it has made an impact in how that defense has looked. Patrick Queen is coming off of a Pro Bowl season with the Baltimore Ravens, and I think he's just as good as any linebacker to step in there and really lead this defense going into next year. They've added some wide receivers, Van Jefferson. They added Cordell Patterson today, actually, before I got on the show. They've added, Quez Watkins, and, those are solid, good depth at that position, as the Steelers always seem to do. But the but comes in now, and they still need that receiver to complement George Pickens legitimately, because they had that in Deontay Johnson, but they traded him away for Dante Jackson, which is a good get back in terms of trading your number one, number two receiver and getting a number one or number two corner back in Dante Jackson. That was a good trade, but they just need somebody else to elevate that position even more. But still, great offseason so far. I've mentioned I like how aggressive they've been. That gets a good grade from me. Moving on to the Chiefs, a bit less of quantity and more quality, because they held on to Chris Jones and Drew Tranquil, their linebacker that showed out last year. So those two were the two biggest needs that they needed on defense, really most of all. On offense, they had mostly everybody coming back. They had some gems in Rashee Rice that showed out as well. So they were pretty set there. Their only major caveat in why I have them ranked here is because they lost L'Jarius Sneed. Obviously, that's going to hurt. That's going to put a dent in how great your offseason is. It would have been flawless if they kept Jones and Sneed and Tranquil, but they traded L'Jarius Sneed to the Tennessee Titans. So that cornerback position is looking a little bit suspect, but like I mentioned yesterday, I think the Chiefs are at their best when their offense is really good, humming on all cylinders, just unstoppable, and their defense only has to be decent and make stops once in a while, because Patrick Mahomes, if he has a great offense, more often than not, he's going to outscore the other team. So the Chiefs, solid offseason, got back crucial pieces, but they lost L'Jarius Sneed. The Vikings as well, I liked what they added on defense in Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, Blake Cashman, Aaron Jones as well. to an offense that already includes Justin Jefferson. Jordan Addison's really great. TJ Hawkinson is probably top 2 or top 3 best tight ends in the game. They have a lot of great pieces. They just obviously lost Kirk Cousins, so they need that quarterback, and that's really the only thing that really made me put them in this category. They lost Kirk Cousins, so they need the quarterback, how important it is. And it's an uncertainty right now if they're going to be able to trade up for one. They have 2 first-round picks, but that's going to be huge in determining, how great this offseason really was. I love what they have on offense, like I mentioned. Defensively, they got better by adding those pieces, and they have a real chance of competing in this division with the Bears that are on the come-up. The Lions, you could say, are the best team, but they definitely didn't seem unstoppable with how that second half went in the NFC Championship. And then you have the Packers as well, who went toe-to-toe with the 49ers and had great games with the Lions, beat them on one occasion on Thanksgiving. So if the Vikings can just get a quarterback, I don't think they're very far off, if at all, from those other teams. And that division should be exciting going forward. But that's where I have the Vikings. And lastly, the Jets, they addressed their biggest needs. Really all of them in this offseason. O-line, wide receiver, and those 2 were the biggest needs. Adding Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, John Simpson, 2 former Ravens, and Tyron Smith from the Cowboys. Their O-line is really revamped and looks brand new, much improved. Got Mike Williams to complement Garrett Wilson. They added Javon Kinlaw from the 49ers, which I think is good on their defensive line. But they still need a safety because they lost Jordan Whitehead. He had an awesome season for them last year, but I'm almost certain he returned to the Buccaneers. So that's going to be a need. Another cornerback to complement Sauce Gardner after losing Bryce Hall. But they've addressed most of their needs that held them back last year, so the Jets get a really good grade from me. Moving on to the next tier, improving, having a solid offseason, but there's still questions elsewhere. The Tennessee Titans, the Washington Commanders, the Atlanta Falcons, the Eagles, and the Chicago Bears. The Titans added Ridley, Cushenberry, Chidobe Awuzie, Tony Pollard, Kenneth Murray, and they traded for L'Jarius Sneed. They've definitely improved, but the question is how Will Levis is going to look, how Brian Callahan is going to look with this new team, handling his own team in a division where the Texans are really the alpha in that division. The Jaguars are nothing to sneeze at as well. And the Colts will give you a good game here or there. So they still have questions, but they're definitely improving. The same could be said for the Commanders. They added a lot of pieces, but they still obviously need that quarterback, which everyone expects them to address. But Dan Quinn, how's he going to look going back to head coaching? Offensive coordinator in Cliff Kingsbury, does that suit him better than head coaching? Because as a head coach, he left a bad taste in everyone's mouths at Arizona. So, those questions are still there. But they definitely improved with Eckler and Biadish coming in as well. The Falcons are also in this tier. Huge upgrade at quarterback with Kirk Cousins to all those weapons. Bijan, Drake London, Kyle Pitts. It's just that defense, man. It's like they have no pass rush. They have good players in Jesse Bates and A.J. Terrell, but they really have no pass rushers. Bud Dupree and Calais Campbell are free agents. So, they have to address that. They definitely improved somewhat. Their team is better, but it's glaring on defense. So that's why they're not in the really good tier. They're in the solid, improving, but they still need a few things to get over. And like I mentioned, the Eagles, good offensive improvements. Saquon being added to the group is the biggest one, obviously. Defensively, they added Devin White, Bryce Huff, and Paris Campbell, as well as Devontae Parker to their receivers. But they were so bad on defense last year. You have to see how the offensive coordinators and the new defensive coordinators fit, because that was such a big problem last year. Those are still uncertainties, but the amount of talent that they have makes them make this part of the list. Very good. They've definitely improved from the players they had, especially on defense last year, but I would love to also see them add another corner because I wasn't the biggest fan of Bradbury last year, so they could still have some area to improve there. And the Bears, just as well as all the other teams, Keenan Allen coming in as well, adding Gerald Everett to this team, DeAndre Swift. It all looks great, but there's still questions around Matt Eberflus, the offensive line, defensive back, middle linebacker. Those are areas that are still glaring, and this is a long-term project as well, but the improvements, the immediate improvements are there. I like what they've done, so they've made this part of the list. And just to round it out, this last part of the segment, the worst off seasons in my opinion, and the ones that just got worse, quite frankly, which are the Bills, the Ravens, and the Giants, and the Cowboys. Like I mentioned a little bit before with the Bills, they lost so many players that it really will make an impact because those guys were locker room guys, were leaders. So that's going to play a bigger role than I think a lot of people will take account into. And you just don't really know what you have on offense right now. Outside of Stephon Diggs, where can you look to? Dalton Kincaid is going to his second year. I get that, but they had so much firepower that now losing it, it's going to look weird. And they've just gone worse because they've lost more players than they've brought in. The Ravens, they've lost a lot of players. They lost Patrick Queen, Geno Stone, John Simpson, Morgan Moses, Ronald Darby, Gus Edwards, Zeitler, Tyler Huntley. And they brought in Josh Jones at the offensive tackle, which was good. Obviously, they brought in Derrick Henry, which has made all the headlines, but those are all starters that they lost and really good players that are now on other teams. And you could refill them through the draft, I guess, but I think those are going to come back to bite them a little bit, and they haven't added players, which is the biggest theme of it all, to try and replenish what they've lost with those guys. The Giants, same thing. Saquon, I talked about it. Not paying him or McKinney really annoyed me. But they added John Runyon from the Packers, and Devin Singletary to kind of soften the blow. But regardless, they've gotten significantly worse. Questions around the quarterback. They are just somehow worse than they were last year. Sorry to say, but it is the reality of it. And the Cowboys, I won't get too much into it. They talk about being all in, but they've only added Eric Kendricks, and they've lost too many players to name right now. So everyone knows where the Cowboys stand. It doesn't look like they're going to add people now because of salary cap restrictions, and that's where they stand. That's the end of my tier list and how I have these teams ranked. I would love to know your guys' feedback on them, what you guys think of these tiers. Do you think someone should be higher? Did I miss out on a team that should be included? Leave it in the comments or let me know in the chat box as well. But that'll do it for that segment on my tier list of the best off seasons. I'm going to send it to the second break, and on the other side, I'm going to talk about all the news, all the quotes that have been coming out recently from the NFL coaches meeting that's been going on over these last few days. So don't go anywhere. You're not going to want to miss that, plus much more, all coming up next.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. I'll get into the next segment, but before I get into all the details of what's coming out of the NFL coaches meeting and all the quotes and interesting rumors and topics that could gain some traction going forward, again, I want to remind you guys for the last time on today's show, if you have any questions or comments, to please use the tip and donations link, which is gsmcpodcast.net. It makes the show a lot more fun, and by using that link, I'm able to see your question pop up right away in the chat box to my right. I'm able to engage with you guys and make this show a lot more conversational. It's a big help for the show, as well as all the shows across the network. We always appreciate it anytime anyone's able to do that for anyone on the show. But like I mentioned, what's being talked about at the NFL coaches meeting, a lot has been said from these coaches and owners somewhat as well, with all the interviews and media availability that they've had to do. They've been asked a ton of questions, and some of the biggest ones were around Mike Tomlin and the Steelers and Jim Harbaugh, the Jets, what their plan is as well. Mike McDaniels had something to say. And I want to start it off by talking about, Jim Harbaugh. He's had a lot of funny quotes, and he's kept it very lighthearted, which is good to see because a lot of times I think these meetings and these media availabilities can get pretty serious with some of the questions and how the coaches interpret it. But he's brought a lot more lighthearted mood and has been very open and has cracked a few jokes here and there with everyone. But one of the biggest things that I found interesting was that how he mentioned 4 quarterbacks could go in the top 4 before they even pick at 5. And he worded it as, he basically has the first pick of the draft almost after the quarterbacks go, top 4, like he says he anticipates. And, I never really thought of it that way, and it's very possible that it does happen. At that point, like I mentioned before, do you take best player available, or because there's an abundance of players, do you trade back just a few trade picks and get more capital and still improve this offense like I hope that they do, because they have no offensive firepower right now? That's an option, but the way that he worded it, it made me think like, wow, like that's actually true. 4 quarterbacks could go, and he could have the pick at anybody that he really wants, because he obviously doesn't need a quarterback. I thought that was really interesting how he said it. The next biggest one is Mike Tomlin, like I mentioned. He worded the competition at quarterback as, Russell Wilson right now stands in the pole position. Those are his words, how he phrased it, right now to be the starter. He also mentioned how Justin Fields oozes talent and that he can't wait to try and extract all that talent. He will have a chance to compete in preseason as well as in training camp. That is typical Mike Tomlin. A lot of good phrases and answers to these questions. But he never really said starter. Russell Wilson is the starter until he's not. He said he's in the pole position, which I interpret as, he sits based on what he has done and what he has shown everybody to be ahead of Justin Fields in being the starter, if that makes sense. He gets a head start in the race, and the finish line is obviously being that starter for the Pittsburgh Steelers. The way that pole position and how I interpreted it as was that he starts 50 meters ahead of Justin Fields in the 400-meter race. To use an analogy, he has had more success with the Seahawks, obviously. He's won a Super Bowl. He's more established longevity-wise than Justin Fields. So he is in the pole position, obviously, like Mike Tomlin said, to potentially be the starter. I think not saying that he's the starter unquestionably right now, I think says a lot. He's leaving the door open, and I don't think Justin Fields is that far behind, in all honesty, just because of that potential that sits there with him and all the talent that surrounds him now. It is exciting to see, but that's something that you can pick out of this by reading between the lines. Not him saying that he's not the starter. I interpreted it that way, and I think it's fair to say that it's a lot closer than most people think. Another thing that kind of relates to free agency now is Mike McDaniels talking about Odell Beckham Jr. I mentioned in a YouTube short that he was meeting with the Miami Dolphins just last week, and nothing really came about that. Nothing has been made official where OBJ is signing, but Mike Daniels did clear it up and said that they actually made an offer to Odell, but he said in his words that business takes time. There's obviously a bunch more suitors out there for Odell Beckham because he is one of the top remaining free agents. I just think that he fits the best with the Miami Dolphins, in my opinion. You got two young wide receivers outside of Odell to really free him up and give him the space that he needs to add to that offense whatever he can. In Baltimore, I think he wasn't that much better than Rashad Bateman or Zay Flowers because of how young they are, not really established. So I think he was looked upon to do more, and I just don't think he's at the point of his career to provide that much more. So now with Waddle, who requires a lot of targets, who'll take up a lot of yards, and looks from Tua, Tyreek Hill obviously goes without saying. I think those two guys are perfect for Odell to just go in there, give whatever he can, and it's not going to hurt the team by him not producing. It's not going to take away from this offense, which was amazing last year. So there's that. Gerard Mayo also touched on their number 3 pick, kept keeping the options open. He said he's open to a trade. In his words, he said the quarterback is a priority, not a certainty. He's ready to start Jacoby Brissett if he needs to, which is what I expected when I talked about it before. I suggested that it was better to start Jacoby regardless of the quarterback, which I anticipate being there, and kind of bridge that gap with him. But it almost sounds like he could be ready to trade out of there and start Jacoby and still be in a position maybe next year to draft a younger guy. You could interpret it a lot of different ways, but keeping the door open there a little bit does leave room for the Minnesota Vikings to trade up. The Denver Broncos have made suggestions that they could trade up. Those teams, the door hasn't been shut on them when it really could have, because there's 3 to 4 really good quarterbacks that are up there, and Gerard Mayo could have just said, yeah, we're going to draft one of them, and we're not moving because we need a quarterback. I think he's really analyzing this and realizing that this team is in need of a lot of things, so trading down would not be the worst thing in the world. Like I've been saying, Antonio Pierce said Aiden O'Connell has earned the right to compete at quarterback, which you could think isn't them giving up on trading up, but he will be fine with Aiden O'Connell starting. He wasn't awful. He had some decent games where he really used the term and utilized the term game manager. He didn't lose them the game. He didn't win them the game, but he was just all right. I think the Raiders could get by with that. Antonio Pierce seems to agree. So there was that. Robert Saleh and the Jets. Saleh said that Aaron Rodgers would be ready to start in the spring and get back to on-the-field stuff. And I thought it was pretty neat that he said that they were planning on making adjustments to their off-season programs to try and cut down on the injuries, which is smart, not only because they've had a lot of injuries in the past already, but because you're bringing in older guys that realistically won't give you as much as they could have before physically. So I like that Robert Saleh is realizing that and trying to make changes to these little nuances that a lot of people wouldn't really think of, but really make a big difference for these experienced veteran guys that the Jets have on their team, and just shows that they're really going all in with this group of older players to try and find success any way they can. And one of the last things is the replay assistant upstairs, the eye in the sky, if you will now be allowed to correct will be allowed to correct certain types of incorrect calls on the field for roughing the passer and intentional grounding. According to Tom Pelissero, those two are the biggest ones, and it's almost like I don't understand why the NFL hasn't really done this like the NBA. I know the game's already long enough, so you don't want to always stop it like the NBA, but these calls are pretty big. Intentional grounding and roughing the passer are always debated very intensely a lot in games that matter and decide games. I don't understand why they wouldn't review him anyway and why the eye in the sky already wouldn't be doing that. But apparently that's going to happen more often now. And the last thing I will say on what's coming out of the NFL owners meeting the last few days, again, revolves around the Jets. Joe Douglas touched on Zach Wilson. Nothing is really close to being done in terms of a trade for him, but, he's keeping the options open. It hasn't really gained that much traction thus far, which is crazy to see, in totality because of how high Zach Wilson was drafted and how young he is still. But, they're still open to it, but nothing's really come of that. And he talked about Jadeveon Clowney. He said that he had an outstanding meeting with him and spent an hour just getting to know him. It was a very productive meeting, but he didn't have any breaking news to give to all the media members on there that were looking for an answer. But, it seems positive. He has other suitors out there as well. But the Jets are very interested in Clowney because before, Shaq Barrett, who signed with the Miami Dolphins, said that he was very close to signing with the New York Jets. But when the Dolphins came calling, he decided to sign with them. So the Jets are obviously looking for a pass rusher. They like Clowney, but they understand that this is a process. This takes time. And it is positive for them in one aspect, but I think it will take some time because Clowney is looking for success now at this point in his career. So if he thinks it'll be with the Jets, I think it'll be a short-term deal, what he has been doing these last few years. But he is fortunate that this last season was very good for him and tying a lot of career highs for him. So he does have that leverage, but that for now rounds off the topics and quotes that have been coming out of the NFL owners meeting. A lot of interesting stuff there that can be interpreted and can be picked on a little bit to create more news, and I'm sure it will create a lot more news and stories, rumors going forward. But that's it for now on that segment. I'm going to send it to the last break of the show, and for the last topic, I'm going to break down the new kickoff rule and my reactions to it, how I feel about it, and how I think new scenarios can come off of this new rule coming to the NFL, specifically on the kickoff. So that last story is coming up after the break on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Back on the show one last time to talk in depth about the new kickoff rule that's coming to the NFL this season. The NFL owners voted on this rule actually today, and it was passed this morning. I think the final vote was 29-3, so it was very popular. And reports beforehand thought that this was very delicate at the point of discussing it because as of late Monday, which was yesterday, sources close to the league weren't sure if this was going to pass, like I mentioned, because they only had 19 approvals in the sort of mock voting that they had on Monday. And you obviously need 24 for a new rule to pass. But today they voted on it officially now, and 29 people voted in favor of it, and 3 people voted against it. So that's a good sign. I'm very glad to see that because I was very excited to see this new format come into kickoffs, into the NFL, because the kickoffs have really been lost over the last year or so. Just in terms of the numbers, looking at it, the amount of touchbacks that have increased from 2010. In 2010, there was 416 touchbacks, and that increased tremendously to almost 2,000 just in 2023. Same thing goes for the return yards that were at 4,500 in 2010 and dropped all the way to 1,300 in 2023. That obviously wasn't going to sit well with the NFL, and NFL Competition Committee Chairman Rich McKay expects this new change to kickoffs, to have an average of 3 to 5 yards advanced field position, which will ultimately lead to more scoring, which is always something the NFL wants. And this whole movement was sort of started by the Cowboys special teams coordinator, John Fassel, and the Saints special teams coordinator as well. They sort of spearheaded and led this revolution of the kickoffs. They actually gathered over 50 special teams coaches at the NFL Combine and got all these heads together to start planning and proposing this new deal at the coaches meeting. It was obviously a great proposal I'm sure they provided all these numbers and stuff like that to back it up. And now the NFL is rocking with it. They've technically said it's a trial year. They're going to review it again in 2025, but I think they'll find good success with it, in all honesty. This new model is kind of taking some bits from the XFL and the sort of kickoffs that they do for the last 2 seasons, so they do expect it to have some success because it's worked for the XFL. And I liked it the way I saw the pictures and the rules. So getting into the rules and breaking down all the rules, I have them all written down here from the article I read. So just bear with me right now if it just sounds like monotone. These are the rules officially for the new format. The new kicking format has the kicking team will still kick from their own 35, but the other players, other than the kicker, on the kicking team will line up on the opponent's 40-yard line, which is new, and those players can't move, and the kicker can't cross the 50-yard line until the ball hits the ground or a receiving player in the new landing zone, which is from the receiving team's goal line to their 20-yard line. So that's a new aspect of it. The kicking team now starts on the opponent's 40-yard line, which is new this year. And talking about the receiving team must have a minimum of 9 players line up in the setup zone, which is between the 30 and the 35-yard line, their own 30 to 35-yard line. And they must have a maximum of 2 returners line up in the landing zone, which I mentioned was from the goal line to the 20-yard line. And just saying those 2 things, the setup zone is from the 30 to the 35-yard line on the receiving team side, and just 10 yards away on that same side of the field is the kicking team. So they start off a lot closer than they used to before. Getting into the kicks, any kick that hits the landing zone has to be returned, while any kick that bounces into the end zone from the landing zone must still be returned or downed for a touchback, but that touchback starts at the 20-yard line if it hit any part of the landing zone and then bounced into the end zone. That's new. Before a touchback, any touchback was at the 25-yard line. So now if the receivers in the landing zone let it bounce in that zone and still roll into the end zone and decide to down it, it'll still be a touchback for them, but it will be a lot further back than it has been in recent years. Any kick that's short of the landing zone, going out of bounds, or just doesn't reach the landing zone, gives the possession to the receiving team on their own 40-yard line. I think that hasn't changed, if I'm not mistaken. I think they got the ball, if they went out of bounds, at the 40-yard line anyway. Another kick, any kick that hits the end zone directly on the fly and is downed in the end zone, so doesn't touch the new landing zone whatsoever, and is caught in the end zone on the fly and is downed for a touchback, that touchback will be at the 30-yard line instead of the 20-yard line because there was no bounce and the kicker hit it directly into the end zone. That one will be given a little bit more leeway, and the team will start at the 30 this time, and any kick that's kicked past the end zone out of the field of play will also be a touchback at the 30-yard line. And like I mentioned, all kickoffs now are really returnable. There's no more fair catches that they tried out last year. It really decreased the amount of kickoffs and was really the main reason why there was no kickoff. So there's no more fair catches. And in terms of onside kicks, teams can't onside kick until the fourth quarter, and a team that's losing has to try that onside kick. Kickoffs after safeties will be from the 20-yard line, and teams that are kicking off will have the option to use a kicking tee if they so choose, but the setup zone and the landing zones won't be any different. And the last thing on these rules is that the penalties that carry over into the kickoffs will only impact the spot of the ball. So again, the landing zone and the setup zone will still be at the 30 to 35 yard line for the setup zone, and the landing zone will still be from the 20-yard line to the receiving team's goal line. Like I mentioned, those are all the rules, and now looking at it and reading through them, it helped to see it on social media as well, how it all breaks down. I think the major part of this was, if you look at kickoffs and why teams decided to just not take them and use the fair catch, was because of how much people were getting hurt, or quite honestly, on these kickoffs. You have these two teams lining up very far from each other, and gaining a lot of speed running down the field, and you have the receiving team trying to block them. You're going to have pretty serious and impactful collisions there, which lead more often than not to some pretty serious injuries. Concussions are always the biggest thing with the NFL. They're trying to limit those. So already starting them from that far and bringing them in closer, it might, you could argue, take away from, I don't know, the excitement of seeing them charging at each other. But I think still starting closer, you're still going to get at least good blocks, and you're going to keep everyone healthy, which is the biggest thing for the NFL, avoiding those serious collisions and reducing the space and the speed that you have some of these players at. With the scoring, and like I mentioned on a YouTube short yesterday, the scoring is actually low nowadays in the NFL. So by bringing it up and by increasing these touchbacks and encouraging more kickoffs, you're going to have better field position, I think, because I think the kickoffs are going to be a lot better with set blocks and with less space for the kicking team to try and attack and tackle the receiving team. I think the blocking is going to be better. You're going to see field position increase, which is what the NFL wants to do. And you're going to see more scoring, which is great for the NFL, great for TV ratings, and makes for a much more entertaining game, which is what most fans would want anyway. Like I mentioned before, the touchback, by hitting the landing zone and rolling into the end zone, I think that's great, because teams can't just watch it roll in and still expect the touchback. You're going to start at your own 20, which is very hard to do, and make a good drive out of that. I love how they're encouraging more kickoffs by including that rule. And it just adds more skill, I think, to more strategy to these kickoffs, because before teams just booted it down the field and nothing came about it. It lost some of that flair. Now, if you want, you could add a bit more skill and strategy with kicks, trying to angle it in a way where it hits the landing zone and still rolls in to put the receiving team in a bad position. You could just decide to kick it into the end zone and make them start from their own 30, angling the kick somewhere where the blocks just don't line up right. And on the other side, receiving, you can have 2 players maximum in the landing zone, but that's the max you can have in there. You could always have 1 and have more blockers ready there to block for you and increase your starting position that way, which is a great way to counter it. But it does have some risk in there as well, because that's a big landing zone, 20 yards of space for one person to cover, and you don't want that thing rolling into the end zone after hitting the landing zone. So I think it just creates a lot more little things that teams have to plan for, strategize for, get quality players, good returners, good kickers with good ball skills and movement on the ball. That just adds another dimension, I think, to the kickoffs that was really lacking. And some people will say that, traditionally they're going away from that. It's not what people want to see. They're taking away all the hard hits and stuff like that. That's just the way the NFL is going, unfortunately. They're trying to make it more high scoring, have the best players out there, trying to reduce injury. They're hindering their defenses with the hip drop tackle, and now if you want to say this kickoff is taking away from the defensive side of the game, you can't have both, honestly. Both sides of, you want to see more points, you want to see high-scoring games, but you also want to see great defense. That leads to low-scoring games, so unfortunately, you can't have both. And just on that aspect, moving on to the last part I want to cover before I wrap it up, the penalties, they didn't really touch on them, but I assume it's going to be illegal touching or illegal formation if people line up in the wrong zones or outside of their zones or touch the ball when they're not supposed to. They didn't really clear those up, but that's a question I have. And as well, just seeing the amount of field position and scoring, the way the NFL is trending right now, I think this was almost inevitable. I mentioned I was a big fan of it. I still share that sentiment. I think this is going to be great by bringing in more excitement. You're going to see more touchdowns, more strategy, like I mentioned. Something different to the game of football that it will take some time to get used to, like all these new rule changes do. But out of the three major ones that we've seen, I think this one's going to have the most success and bring the most positive reviews out of all the rule changes that have happened so far. So, again, I would love to know what you guys think. If you guys hate all of these rules, if you like one of them, which one do you like more than the other? I always would want to know what you guys think of those and what you think of what I said on those rules as well, if you share some of the same feelings that I do on the kickoffs and all the other new rules as well. But in saying that, that's going to do it for me on today's episode. As always, please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Make sure to also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok for more of the network's content. If you want to see more of this show's content and more of me, check out the GSMC Sports Network channel on YouTube and the GSMC Podcast Network as well on YouTube, where all the live shows are recorded in their entirety. If you want to go back and rewatch a whole show, YouTube shorts are posted daily on there by me. Those are found there as well, on top of individual segment videos that you can watch if you missed a certain segment or you want to go back and rewatch a specific topic. You can do that. It's all on both of those channels. And one last reminder to tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more football conversations around the NFL, more topics, and more discussions with me, your host, Manny Maradiege. Thanking you guys for tuning in once again, and I will see you guys all tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet.